and welcome to the next episode of my Learn With Me Hydrasynth series. This is episode 16, Voice Modes. So first, what is Learn With Me? Learn With Me is a series where you get to follow my end-to-end process of learning to get the best out of a synthesizer. In this case, the ASM Sound Machine's Hydrasynth Explorer. This is a shrunk-down version with the same sound engine as the original Hydrasynth. The main physical changes are the 49-note full-sized keys have been replaced with 37 mini keys, still with polyphonic aftertouch. The ribbon controller is absent, and instead of the 8 encoders and 8 buttons, we have 4 encoders and 4 buttons. So far, I've talked you through my feelings on the build quality, the control paradigm, I've described the signal flow, and we've dug into each one of the sound modules, as they call them, in the synthesis engine, and we've looked at the mod matrix. That leaves us with 2 other sections to dig into, voices and macros. Today we're going to look at the voice section. There are a lot of parameters in here, and they seem to be all coherently related, but quite disjoint. So it is what it is. So first parameter is polyphony, and it defaults to poly. This means we can use all 8 voices. 8 voice. Next mode is mono, of which there are 2 counterpart modes, mono low and mono high. These are note priorities. So when playing monophonically, if you press more than one note at a time, it has to decide which of those notes the voice will be allocated to. In mono mode, this is the last note you played. So if I played one note, held it, played a higher note and a lower note, and all of them sounded when I pressed them, in the order I pressed them. If I select low note priority, when I play a higher note, nothing happens. When I play a lower note, it does. So you can imagine if I was playing chords, only the low note would be picked. High is comparable, so only the highest note is played. We have unison modes, and with their counterpart low and high. Unison I tried to use previously and was a little bit confused, and the reason I was confused is these 2 parameters, density and detune, do probably what you expect. Density picks the number of voices in the unison, detune picks how detuned those voices are. What I hadn't considered was that the density does not remain, you do not maintain polyphony. This is a monophonic mode. So with a density of 1, I thought I could play 8 notes, but I can only play 1, whatever the density is. So let's listen to increasing density. All the way up to 8 voices, gets pretty big. Now let's detune. So that classic detuned lead sound works pretty well. Let's hop back down to let's say poly mode, and next we're going to look at this analog parameter. So the analog parameter is intended to simulate some of the behavior of an analog synth, in particular the instability of tuning and the instability of other parameters such as possibly filter cutoff and envelope time. They don't say exactly what happens, they say it affects the entire signal path. Note that a lot of synthesizers have an ability to drift and diverge the oscillator and voice tuning, so if it does more than that, that's a kind of value add here. In order to hear it, it probably makes sense to bring in 2 oscillators so we can hear that they will detune against each other as well as the other changes. So let me play a note. So we can hear the phasing starting to come in, and the beat frequency speed up as we increase that. Now let's play. So I think you can hear some variation as I play across that. Let me turn that back down. Go to the next page. The next set of parameters are stereo placement of the voices. Now note that in the mixer we have access to pan controls for the oscillator, the noise, and the ring mod. These are pan positions of the voices, not the oscillators. The oscillator panning applies relative to the voice panning. So if you use all of this panning, you can get very wide and very granular stereo images, which could be interesting. The first parameter is the algorithm used to allocate those voices. They are rotate, alternate, and random. And the next parameter is the width, which indicates how much of the stereo spectrum should be utilized by that algorithm. 0 meaning only the very center, 127 meaning the entire stereo spectrum. So if I turn that up to the max, and let's listen on rotate. Just a quick aside, if you are in a mono mode, any of the 3 mono modes, this does not work. I expected that random or rotate might work in mono, but they do not. Just so you're aware, because it confused me for a little while. They do work in unison, they do work in poly. This is rotate. So what rotate does is, for the 8 voices, as they are numbered internally, they are placed left to right in the stereo spectrum. So if I play a chord, you may notice that some of those notes seem to move position in the stereo spectrum. That is because the voice allocation depends on the micro timing of me pressing these keys. So that means that they're not going to get the same voice allocated to them every time, and there's no real control over that. It is an interesting feature to have, and I could imagine some maybe arpeggiators. When you're arpeggiating, it might be interesting to get movement like that. And if you use the different number of notes to the number of voices, you'll get some phasing in the stereo motion. So I think that could be interesting anyway. The next one, and which is the default and possibly the most usable, is alternating. So instead of numbering the voices using their internal numbering, when you press more than one note, they are given a number as they are added, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So 1, 2, 3. These get placed just left of center, correspondingly right, further left, further right, further left, further right, and so on. So it means that as we add notes, the stereo image gets wider. So I think that's quite interesting. So now let's turn that back down. Let's look at these next 2 parameters. We referred to the analog parameter doing this instability simulation. There are another couple of things which happen in analog synthesizers. First, on a digital synthesizer, or rather in the digital domain, you ordinarily get a linear response to some input parameter until it reaches a maximum, at which point it gets set to that value. So saturation is clipping in the digital domain. One of the consequences of that is that when you approach that saturation point on a digital synth, nothing happens until you hit it, and then you get very harsh clipping, which introduces a lot of high end. On an analog synthesizer, often there is a non-linear relationship between the amplitude and the voltage. So this means that the waveforms that should be hitting the peak get rounded out. Sonically, when a waveform has a sharp edge, that represents high frequencies. When it has a curved edge, that represents low frequencies. So what does that mean? When approaching saturation or maximum volume level, a digital synthesizer typically has more high harmonics introduced, and an analog synthesizer introduces more low harmonics. Warm mode is, that is sometimes referred to as warmth in a synthesizer. Effectively, boosted low end, less high end. Warm mode has a similar tilt EQ that gets applied to give you that sound. So let's listen. So I can definitely hear a low end boost, maybe subtle high end loss, but that is what that is for. Next, random phase. By default, when playing, every voice, when you trigger it, all of the oscillators get reset to their 0 phase. So every time they play, the phase will be identical. This gives very consistent, repeatable notes. So if I go down a little lower, you can hear the attack and the overall sound is identical every time. Now let me turn on random phase. Hopefully you could hear that variation there. So what is that for? On an analog synthesizer, often the oscillators are free running, meaning they are not reset when you press a note, they just carry on proceeding at the pitch that you set them to. This means that because audio rate and musical time are usually very far removed from one another, the phase at which the oscillator begins playing any given musical note is random. It's not technically random, but it is uniformly distributed unless there is a coincidence between the BPM and the frequency you happen to be playing, and you play it over and over again. So this simulates that free running by randomization. You can imagine that between the analog parameter, between the random phase and the warm mode, you could probably achieve some interesting instability and warm analog-like tones. And I think that's a thing worth bearing in mind here. Analog synthesizers, often you cannot turn these things off. That warmth related to how saturation functions is inherent. You may be able to have it reset phase, but often you can't, in which case this is an inherent parameter and some amount of this analog fluctuation is inherent. So when you have a digital synthesizer like this, you have to dial in those parameters. When you have an analog synthesizer, they are already there, but you can't turn them off. So there are different purposes for every synthesizer. And the analog subtractive synthesizer is not inherently the best type of synthesizer. So this is not aiming to be one of those, but it's aiming to provide the tools to simulate one if you wish. Next, we have parameters relating to these two touch strips. These touch strips are a pitch bend. You hear when I release that, it springs back. So it actually has some slew limiting to the value. Equally, when I tap it, you can hear a woo woo, you can hear a bend in pitch as opposed to a hard cut. So these are slew limited to some extent. Bear in mind also that you can set that range, which is currently 2 semitones, down to 0, and this is a modulation source in the mod matrix. It still exhibits that springing behavior, but you have another modulation available here if you wish. Equally for vibrato. Vibrato, 2 semitone. We can set that to 0, and this now becomes another modulation source at our disposal. You may also note that this is a 5 Hz rate. Well, none of these are flashing at 5 Hz, so which LFO is it? There is a 6th hidden internal LFO, which is not available in the mod matrix, only for vibrato. So you do not need to use an LFO for vibrato. There's one here. It can BPM sync. Nice little feature. Next is glide modes. Now, I'm going to move to mono for this, and I'm going to tell you why. Because when you play polyphonically, remember I said the micro timings of the notes that I press affect which voice gets allocated. And if I'm not playing 8 notes every time, well then there's going to be some phase shift in what voice each note corresponds to, even if I play them the same every time. The glide is done on a per voice basis. So if I press, let me go into polyphonic mode just so you can hear what I'm talking about there. There is not a coherent mapping between the voices which get selected. Because the glide time is quite fast, it kind of sounds okay. But it's not strictly doing a one-to-one correspondence. So for this demonstration, in any case, I'm going to be in monophonic mode. The parameters of interest here are first the glide time, which is how rapidly the pitch moves between the notes that you're pressing. Next is glide curvature. So by default, it approaches the destination pitch linearly, as in it doubles in pitch. Let me restate that. That time indicates how long linearly it will take to move from this pitch to this pitch. We have a curvature parameter which allows us to make that pitch movement over that time be exponential, meaning it approaches it slowly and then quickly, or logarithmic means it approaches it quickly and then slowly. That's what the curvature is here for. Finally, we have this legato mode. Which means that if we play legato, glide is in effect. If we do not play legato, glide is not in effect. Let's turn glide off for now. Final page, which confused me again. The upper 2 parameters relate to pitch quantization. The lower parameter is an envelope parameter called snap, which is supposed to make envelopes sound more snappy. So I feel like maybe I can detect a hint more softness in the envelopes when it's off, but I'm not sure. But anyway, that is a parameter that is supposed to help with more punch in bass and percussive sounds, and it defaults to on. The upper two parameters here are your scale modes. So by default, it is key of C chromatic. The key doesn't matter in this case because chromatic means I can play all of the notes. I can go back one to custom scales, in which case I can set which notes are in the scale. You can have up to 8 notes, so I just made a major scale and I added the flat 7 to it. So now if I try to play chromatically, you could hear that it's snapping this to the nearest note, snapping this to the nearest note, and so forth. Beyond the chromatic scale is major scale, and I expected the second one to be minor, but it's not. And there's a whole family of them, and there isn't one that's actually called minor. There is Aeolian, which has the same notes as minor, and there is a pretty significant selection available. But I was scrolling through all of them because after those is a set of microtonal scales. In the system setup, there is a way to upload and manage these microtonal scales. They're not editable on device, but you can use other software to do that. This is a quarter tone scale. So normally we have one tone between adjacent notes. This is a quarter of that. So if I go, I was going up 4, or you can hear. That's maybe not the most useful of them, but they're a whole family and you can introduce your own. So if you're into microtonal music, then I think that's a nice opportunity for you. What I'm going to do is, since there isn't minor, and I probably could have stopped at Aeolian, I wanted to play in E minor, and I just want to have this enabled to see how it works. So I'm going to set it to G major, which has the same notes as E minor. So the notes are available, it doesn't matter where I'm starting. Let's now design a little lead sound and let's try and use some of these voice parameters. So first some glide. Some glide there. I like the pitch bend and vibrato being available. I think I'm going to go for a unison sound here. So let's go maybe density 4. Bit of detune. I think that's probably okay for now. Let's bring some of this in. Let's bring warm modes, phase randomization in. Anything else to change? Oh, let's go to alternating modes and add some stereo width. Sounding good already. Let's make a little envelope. Now let's add a bit of little velocity sensitivity, not too much, I think it's not. Let's set some resonance on the filter and a little cutoff, and now little velocity sensitivity, and now let's shape this envelope. Let's set that quite long. You could see there that I was trying to play in a different key and the snap was on and I had some unusual results. Let's add some effects quickly, chorus. A little delay. Go for the ping pong maybe. Okay, so let's play a little bit and see how this sounds, and then I think we'll be done for today. So pretty simple, but I think we managed to get a little bit more of what you think of as an analog flavor out of that sound just by using some of the simple parameters in the voice modes. I'm going to come back next and we're going to talk about the macro modes before getting into doing some demonstrations of more complex sound design. I would like to thank you for joining me today. I hope you've been enjoying the series. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you'll join me for some more. But most importantly, thank you and goodbye.